welcome back to Media 120. Again, I apologize for the delay on some of the information. Holiday weekend, I was out of town, and then on top of it, I got very sick over the weekend. I had planned to record all this on Sunday night, and it didn't work out. So I'm recording it now and posting it. So if you are a person who likes watching these and gets something out of them, which I hope you do, I put a lot of time and effort into them. Hopefully you waited, or if you already took a look at the slides and stuff and want to watch this along with that, all more power to you. Anyway, be sure to read the chapter as well. The chapter has some other information. This is kind of all, my slides are all from kind of old lectures from old versions of the class, my own kind of take on stuff, some other professors' takes on stuff. So it's kind of like meant to be more discussion based and more like thought provoking, and then there's obviously more in the chapter as well. So like I always say, if you're struggling with the quizzes and stuff like that, be sure to refer back to the chapter along with your lectures and stuff. So we're going to dive right in. There will be two lectures on television. The first one is the history of television. The second is the development of cable. So if you want to watch this one first, this is going to be on the history of television, and we're going to go right in. Forgive me in advance. You'd think that the chapter on the history of television would be really exciting, and it is interesting. But there's also a lot of just like descriptions of old white guys who are filing patents and stuff like that. So I'm going to try to get through this and make it as lively and interesting as possible, and all that. Yeah, we're going to dive right in. So, television. Development leads to major growth. Basically, what that means is at the turn of the century, turn of the 19th into the 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, it's still in the middle of Industrial Revolution, and inventions and progression is just kind of booming. We have stuff like the telegraph, the telephone, kind of really blowing up and changing the way people think about technology and all that. Both the telegraph and the telephone kind of gave people this idea of sending electrical impulses over long distances. So people were wondering whether or not they could send an image. We have kind of sounds, we have, dots and information, but can we send actual images, and how would we be able to do that? So in 1884, this man named Paul Nipkow patents an electrical telescope in Germany. And in 1885, he develops this kind of disc. It's about the size of a phonograph, so, this big, and formed the basis for TV development in the 1920s. Where did the TV come from? The word television appeared as early as 1907 in Scientific America. Before then, image transition would have been called a bunch of different things. They were really gung-ho about this idea. Obviously, visual awareness, visual radio, electrical vision. Think about it, how people kind of had this idea for an iPad or an iPhone for decades before the technology existed. It was very clear that, like, oh yeah, eventually we'll be able to hold like a laptop and be able to touch it and stuff like that. And that, as early as the 60s or 70s, we had these ideas. And it took a really long time to catch up to it. Same thing goes with the TV. People had this idea. They kind of knew that they wanted some version of what became a TV before that. So Marconi, remember our friend from radio, he eliminated sound's dependence on wires and put sound into the airwaves. And Lee De Forest, also remember from the radio, had the Audion tube, which amplified radio waves so that people could hear the sound clearly. And then David Sarnoff came along and kind of zhuzhed that all into television. There's also a man named Vladimir Zworykin. He worked with Sarnoff and Paul Westinghouse to develop the Iconoscope. It was an all-electronic TV camera tube system that transformed visual image into radio waves. So basically it transmitted them through the air and into a receiver set. So if you've seen or read any version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Willy Wonka, Mike TV, he gets like transmitted into a tiny little guy into the TV. They do it with the chocolate bars. That's pretty much exactly how it works. You take the information and it sends it into like billions of particles through the air, and then it goes into the receiver, the same way kind of with radio and stuff. So this man named John Logie Baird, in the mid-20s, he developed the first TV, but it couldn't really work commercially. It didn't. The technology wasn't there. Sorry, my light's all over the place. That's better. And by the mid-30s, England was already on the air. In 1923, television as a mass-produced product kind of became a possibility. This guy, Philo T. Farnsworth, patented the electronical image dissector tube, known as a cathode ray tube, CRT, and it produced a much clearer picture to the original mechanical scanning device. In 1927, they transmitted the first TV picture electronically in the air, and in 1930, he patented the first television. So here we have a picture of the CRT. Basically, it sends all this information through this little tube and into this, conic device that spreads it out and is able to show the image. And TVs used to have this like in them. Like when they were big boxes, they would have this in the back of them. It would send the light and information through. It would have a receiver and then send the information through and shine out through a light. You could, if you are interested in that, you could all, look up YouTube videos of, different stuff like that. Television during the war, that kind of stalled things. TVs were not really a priority. They were not produced 1942 to 1945. They worked in industry standards instead. They hoped they would have less confusion than radio stations did, and they kind of hoped to have a baseline for, like, this is what the industry standard for what a TV is, what the television channels are going to be, and they were hoping that after the war they would take off, and they were completely right. Once the war was over, it became very popular. And those standards, those industry standards, were set by the NTSC standard set in 1941, the National Television Systems Committee. 525 line image scan electronically at 30 frames per second was the standard issue for all television in the U.S. Great Britain and U.S. would adopt a higher standard, so they'd have slightly higher definition. We also had 13 VHF, very high frequency channels, and if you can click on that YouTube video, it'll kind of show a little information about VHF back then. It's not dissimilar from when TVs became a lot more affordable and HD became a thing. Before it was kind of blanket everything HD, there were only a few select channels that were offered in HD. It was kind of some sports channels, some HBO channels and stuff like that, and it wasn't until the past 15 or so years that it became pretty much the standard that everything's just going to be in a high definition. So very similar to that model. In 1948, we had a freeze, the freeze in 1948. The FCC declared a freeze on any new licenses between 48 and 52. During this time, they kind of redid those standards and practices. They set the industry standard that TV should be in color. They fixed a lot of co-channel interference by making channels have to be every other channel. So if you were channel 5, there couldn't be a channel 6. There was channel 5 and 7 and 9, or it skipped even more just to have less interference. And it reserved space for high-definition television at the time. In the 50s, things grew even more TVs and more homes. Broadcast lengthened from 15 to 30 minutes. And it introduced a magazine format and TV spectaculars, which are these kind of like big, variety shows that would happen maybe once a week or once a month with all these celebrities and stuff like that. Game shows at the time were the most popular. They borrowed this from radio, and they impacted the audience's view on TV. There's a democratic expectation that like anybody could be on these shows, anyone could participate, and it was a true blending of high and low culture. High culture in a sense that some of these were like trivia based. You had to know a lot of information, and low culture because it was for everyone, and anybody could do it. And a little more, and it was also like a little silly and zany, so that was a little bit of the low culture being blended. Audiences' response to TV. Well, in large markets, in the 50s, nobody started going out on Thursday nights anymore. They didn't want to miss their shows. They'd eat dinner in front of the TV. Theaters were closing. People had free entertainment in their own homes, and they kind of thought, why go to the movies 3 times a week when I can watch something every single night? People stopped going to the library and reading books. Kind of all those things, all that doom and gloom that people talk about with streaming, with phones and stuff. Same stuff was happening with TV. But in smaller markets, when people couldn't afford to have more than one TV or a TV at all, theater attendance went up. Movies were still relatively cheap, and they would still go in those markets. So more theaters were being built in those markets to kind of compete with television. In 1952, the FCC filed a 6 reporting order, which is just more industry practices. They added a UHF band, ultra high frequency, which added 70 new channels. 66% of all channels were on the UHF. And it also set up this city by city allotment, which meant no 2 channels could operate on the same channel if they were closer than 200 miles apart. This minimized interference, and they separated adjacent channels. So NBC might be channel 4 in Chicago, but it's channel 7 in St. Louis, just to avoid any confusion. And some channels were close on the dial, but not on bandwidth, which meant that the actual frequency would be really different, but they might be on the dial number, might be something closer, which caused interference. With this 6 report, educational channels kind of took up 10% of all space, and it issued color TV. There was kind of this big battle between CBS and RCA. The issue was not really solved at first. CBS was mechanical and RCA was more electronic, and RCA won, kind of becoming the biggest contributor to color TVs at the time. It did have some unintended side effects. Limited the major players to 3 major networks, the big 3, which were ABC, CBS, and NBC. Most major networks had only 3 VHF channels. This killed the 4th network, which was called the Dumont Network. In the 80s, we saw the boom of cable television news, 24 news cycles. CNN kind of comes out of the 80s. News at that time becomes blended with the entertainment industry. It kind of becomes its own kind of version of entertainment, which had lasting implications that we all know about today, where we're looking at why is news the way it is versus how it was in the 70s and 60s. It's because it's much more dependent on their viewership because there's so much news and you have this whole cycle, as opposed to just standard the news at 6 o'clock kind of thing that it used to be. Public television kind of also started to die out. PBS was created in the late 60s, but the federal funding for it drops in the 1980s. Sponsors, the viewers like you, the whole thing that says at the end of PBS, fund about 25% of public television by the 2000s. Now, if you watch PBS, it's mostly reruns. It's mostly old kind of documentaries, Ken Burns stuff. They don't create a lot of new information. Even Sesame Street has kind of jumped ship onto HBO. It's a little sad because it's a big deal. But them's the breaks. The world changes. So what's next for television out of that? Cable. So we're going to wrap up this lecture and move on to the development of cable and talk about all of that and what came out of that world and what comes out of that from there. So I know I just threw a lot at you really fast. As always, be sure to, feel free to go back and rewatch, write stuff down, a lot of names, a lot of different stuff, and make sure you're reading the chapter. Like I said, it's a little more boring than I would like it to be. We're talking about television. There's just a lot of like radio and stuff, it started so early there was kind of this arms race between a bunch of old rich white guys who were trying to just get a buck. But it is interesting, to look at those early developments and where we are today. So be sure to watch the next one, the development of cable, and then we will talk about that. All right, see you then.